Hello and welcome to everyone today who is attending our final webinar in the joint series with SQA on assessment. The focus of today's webinar is significantly broader than in webinars 1 and 2, and today we'll be looking at best practice in assessment across a range of qualification blocks at different SCQF levels, not simply focusing on the new national qualifications. So to help us get a feel for the levels you're currently teaching, I'm going to pass briefly back to George to run the first of today's webinar polls. Great, thank you very much for that feedback, folks. That will make things a little bit easier to contextualise what we're discussing today. So, as we mentioned previously, today is about looking at best practice in unit assessment. And the webinar aim is to do two things with you today. Firstly, to provide you with a bit of a recap on the key principles that drive and support effective assessment, but also to help you make sense of some of the more common terms that you might be hearing to do with assessment and assessment practice, and what they mean for you as a lecturer working in colleges in Scotland today. Throughout today's webinar, the focus will be about supporting you to use assessment methods and approaches purposefully and with increasing confidence when assessing your learners. At the end of webinar 2, for those of you who maybe attended that or who have looked at the presentation on CDN's website, we highlighted some useful pre-reading that would have helped before attending today's session. But don't worry if you're not familiar with these resources, as we will be discussing key aspects of these and also highlighting where these resources can be found in today's presentation. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Fiona Malone, our SQA presenter for today, for the main part of the presentation. So thank you, Fiona.
Thank you, Sandra Jane. Again, it's lovely to be back. I think just to put in a context of what we're going to be chatting about today in terms of assessment, let's first think about the purposes of assessments. Let's go back a little bit and think of the bigger picture here. You know that assessment is the process of evaluating an individual's attainment of knowledge, understanding and skills. It has many uses, but can be divided into two major categories. Assessment for individuals as candidates and as a vehicle for measure for external organisations. So in terms of candidates, it's used for diagnostic purposes in terms of pre or early on in the delivery to identify candidate strengths and weaknesses. It's also to help aid individual progress by identifying an appropriate learner path for an individual. Formative, that's where it's ongoing. So again, it takes place in the learning environment to provide information on a candidate's progress. It's used to set learning goals, for example, progressing to say course assessment and to provide constructive feedback. And then finally for candidates, summative. That's, if you like, the formal or end of a unit or course assessment, and it's for certification. It's used for awarding formal qualifications when the individual learning is assessed against a particular specification or standard. And really importantly, candidates should be informed that their assessment results will be recorded and quality assured by SQA. In terms of organisations, they will use assessment for diagnostic, formative and summative purposes to check on candidates' progress and achievement. Many different types of organisations, like colleges, for example, use qualification results either as a measure of attainment for entry or to evaluate the performance levels of the wider system. SQA qualifications can also be used as quality indicators. For example, the Scottish Funding Council, SDS and Sector Skills Councils use SQA qualifications to assess the quality of individual centres, as does Scottish Government and Education Scotland, and local authorities use qualification data to evaluate success at a local or national level. And finally, SQA. We must also ensure that our qualifications provide national and international recognised standards of attainment. As well as assessment specifications, We have external verification of internally assessed units, annual grade boundary meetings for national courses, and monitoring of all qualifications across all centres, and I'll talk to you about that later on in the webinar. But what about you as an assessor? What choice of assessment do you have when it comes to SQA units? Units are not graded, with the exception of the graded unit at Higher National Certificate and Diploma. But what's important about SQA's qualification system is it's built on national units of core and options. These units are not graded, but they reflect competence in a range of knowledge and skills, often which helps towards understanding either an entire vocational area or towards an overall course assessment. As an assessor, you have discretion in how you assess these units. You can select from SQA's offering or develop your own. And we're planning to deliver a webinar in the near future on writing your own unit assessments later this session. Your assessment instrument, or sometimes referred to as an assessment method, can be designed to generate evidence by unit, across units, or taking a portfolio approach. Remember too, as per in webinar 2, for national qualifications, you also have the option of devising cut-off, scores, thresholds, and taking a holistic approach too. It's really important though that SQA ensures that its qualifications are credible with users, partner organisations, the wider community, and that they do provide national and international recognised standards of attainment. This means that all of our qualifications and their assessment methods must meet our principles of assessment. So what do we mean by principles of assessment? Well, in terms of SQA, we talk about validity, reliability, practicability, and something being equitable and fair. So let's now look at each of these in turn. Validity is a measure of accuracy of an assessment, and that's really important when it comes to assessing your candidates. The assessment method you're using is valid when it is appropriate for its purpose, allows candidates to show that they have the required knowledge, understanding and skills, allows you as an assessor to make a reliable assessment decision, and allows the interpretation and inference which can be drawn from the assessment outcomes to be meaningful and justifiable. So for validity to work, it has to be ensured at each stage of the assessment process. That's during the planning, the setting, the judgment and the feedback. And there's two key aspects of validity that SQA are concerned about. The first of these is called content validity, and that's the measure of how closely the content of an assessment matches the content of the unit specification. It's concerned with the level of knowledge, understanding and skills that is required to meet the standard of the unit or qualification. The second area is construct validity, and that concerns the extent to which an assessment actually measures what the unit specification states it is intended to measure. For example, an assessment that asked a candidate to write about a skill rather than demonstrate it would have low construct validity. Both types of validity are achieved by subject experts selecting the most appropriate assessment method. The choice of an assessment method and the development of the assessment itself will require you to exercise your professional expertise and judgment. You must be familiar with the unit requirements to identify beforehand the skills that the candidate has to be able to demonstrate and the knowledge and understanding they need to attain. So unit assessment should reflect and support learning activities, be capable of generating evidence that is consistent with the required level of skills, focus on larger themes, topics or tasks covering connected outcomes, and that's particularly important if a candidate is progressing towards the course assessment, and provide opportunities to combine assessments where appropriate. SQA categorises methods of assessment into 3 broad areas: that of observation, product evaluation and questioning. So any SQA unit outcome are written to describe an activity which can be observed, a product which can be evaluated, and knowledge, understanding and analytical skills. Within SQA's Guide to Assessment, we currently have 14 methods of assessment categorised under these headings. And some of the examples are case studies, exams or written tests, oral questions, a performance, practical activity, professional discussion and a project, to name a few. Page 18 of the SQA's Guide to Assessment provides the full list for you. What I'd like to do now is give you your second poll of today. Let's move on now to our second principle about reliability. Reliability is a measure of the degree of consistency with which candidates' assessment evidence is judged. So assessment decisions should be consistent across all assessors, for all candidates undertaking the same assessment method. Reliability, therefore, is achieved by assessments with high content and constructive validity. In other words, the extent to which the assessment method actually measures what the unit spec states it is intended. The use of conditions of assessment, and we'll discuss these shortly, and any standardisation activities by assessors. Be very careful of bias and also the relationship between validity and reliability, which again we'll talk about later on. If no conditions are specified in the unit specification, you should ensure that where appropriate, conditions are set for your assessment and applied consistently to all candidates. SQA assessment packs will provide useful guidance in this context, and the prior verification process will also provide feedback on this too. Some examples of conditions can include whether or not candidates may have access to materials such as reference books during the assessment, sometimes known as open or closed book. For example, if the assessment is a test of knowledge and understanding, you may wish to specify that it will be carried out under closed book conditions. However, if it's based on, for example, candidate research or investigation, you may wish to specify that it's open book. So your conditions are determined by the context of the assessment method. Any other resources which candidates may have access to during the assessment, again to make sure the assessment runs smoothly. Also the amount of time for the assessment task, and again we'll talk about time and the amount of time you can give to assessment later on in this webinar. The approximate number of words, and that's particularly important where there's a write-up involved of a project, an essay or an assignment. The amount of support that candidates may expect from assessors. Whether the assessment or any parts of it should be carried out under supervision. And finally, authentication. How can you prove that it actually is the candidate's work? Let's move on to our third principle of assessment, and that's practicability. This is concerned with resources. Any resources that you need to effectively apply the assessment method that you're using needs to be cost effective and manageable over time. And that's really important, especially in the current climate of working within very tight budgets. And costs. Any assessment method should be cost effective. Time and volume of evidence. We mentioned this earlier, so let's talk about this now in a little bit more detail. From an SQA perspective, we don't have any rules regarding assessment time. Time of assessment should be proportionate and appropriate for the learner. As a guide, we would normally expect the assessment time for a unit to be approximately 1 hour. However, the assessment time should be reflected in the amount or volume of evidence expected. For example, for units in national courses where there are a practical or process-based activity, there is sometimes a need to allow more time than 1 hour. Where it's not possible to distinguish between preparation for assessment, for example, materials, setting up of equipment, gathering information, and the actual assessment, then 4 hours is a notional guide to the time needed for preparation and assessment activity. The 4 hours may include a maximum of 1 hour for any final stage of assessment, such as a write-up or producing a final product. So what I'd like to do now is go on to poll 4. Thank you for that, folks. So let's look now at the final principle of assessment that SQA wants to always make sure is applied. And this is about assessments that are equitable and fair. The first thing to think about here is accessibility. And how an assessment is accessible is through the language that's used within that assessment. So in other words, information, instructions and wording should be clear. Some verbs, for example, command words used in outcomes and assessment standards should be the same as in the assessment method. What's important here too is that the command words should reflect the level of demand for the unit or course. And also remember, keep sentences short with simple structure and careful punctuation. For example, if I was to say to a candidate, an experiment was being undertaken by 2 learners, compared with 2 learners were doing an experiment, the second one is clearer in terms of what the context for the assessment is. Similarly, if I said in an assessment, why did the government frown upon, whereas if I said or asked, why did the government disapprove of X, it should be clearer to the candidate what the expected response should be. For guidance on the use of assessment arrangements for disabled candidates and or those with additional support needs, please consult the assessment arrangements webpage on SQA's website. And also page 43 and 44 of our guide to assessment in terms of providing reasonable assistance. However, to ensure assessments are equitable and fair, you should also think about the following. Does the assessment offer all candidates an equal opportunity to demonstrate their attainment? Are the scenarios or contexts in the assessment open and comprehensible to all candidates? Could any part of the assessment or the assessment itself have an adverse impact on disabled candidates or any other group? And finally, does any illustrative material reflect an inclusive view of society which promotes equality? And finally, authentication. It's all well and good having selected the right assessment method and applied all the appropriate conditions of assessment and thought about time and volume, if you cannot prove that the evidence presented actually belongs to that candidate. So as the assessor, you have to decide when to say that the candidate has provided enough evidence of sufficient quality to...
Thank you, Fiona, for that. That was a really thorough explanation of some of the key principles behind assessment. What I'd like to do now is just to run through a few things to do with best practice in assessment planning. But as you know, the best laid plans can sometimes go awry. But that doesn't preclude the importance of pre-planning what it is you're trying to achieve with your learners. And it definitely will reassure you as a lecturer that you are on track and you are able to meet the expected standards and deliver the type of learning that you would expect for all our learners. So the first thing here that's really important is that you really know your units and also any unit assessment support packs or higher national assessment support packs that you're actually working with. One of the things that I would stress that you look at are the history of changes pages, and those appear at the very end of the unit specifications. And it's also good practice to ensure that you are regularly checking the SQA website and checking the history of changes pages in case there have been any updates or clarifications that have come through the verification process. It's also really important that you understand the standard expected, and there's a variety of ways you can do that. You have the national standard as defined by the Understanding Standards materials for some qualifications within the SQA web pages. But as Fiona mentioned earlier, having a clear understanding of what the command words mean within unit and also course assessments is going to be really helpful in ensuring your learners are prepared effectively for any assessments you're delivering, but also that they can perform effectively in any course assessments too. The SCQF level of the qualification will give you some hints and tips about what is expected in terms of the complexity and the demand at a particular SCQF level for any qualification. The second thing, as was mentioned previously, and we highlighted this in more detail in webinars 1 and 2, was that you really need to decide early on in your assessment approach and on which assessment methods you're going to use. And part of that is considering the purpose of assessment. Are you planning formative assessment, for example, to ensure that your learners are adequately prepared and will hopefully pass a summative assessment at first attempt? Are you ensuring that there is sufficient variety and range and diversity within the assessment methods that you use? Or are you continually assessing your candidates using the same type of assessment method? And that could actually be contributing or creating bias where certain assessments are more easily achieved by certain people within the class. The scheduling and the timelines of assessment planning is also something that must be factored in. And we know that students and staff can have assessment hotspots within any planned assessment timeline, and these are really important to try to avoid. So when you will assess your learners, the timing and also the timing of any reassessment needs to be carefully planned and also managed. When determining the type of assessment method, it's also worthwhile considering your natural teaching and learning approach, because that may well give you an indication as to whether your natural style for assessment would be to gather it through, for example, a portfolio assessment approach, where you are gathering naturally occurring evidence of assessment through that teaching and learning, allowing the assessment process to flow naturally from that teaching and learning process and not simply be a bolt-on end-of-unit activity. The third point here is about considering learners within the assessment process. And it's increasingly important, particularly as you move up the SCQF levels, to involve and to try to create opportunities to get learners involved in the assessment process itself. And this might be, for example, in diagnostic or in formative assessment, where they are peer assessing and providing feedback to one another on particular tasks or activities, but also through, for example, in giving them a choice of how they might wish to present the assessment evidence for summative assessment purposes. And within some of the new units at national qualification level, there is scope for choosing how to present that type of assessment evidence. Fiona mentioned previously the section on reassessment and the importance of marking instructions. It's really important that in addition to thinking about the clarity of the wording, that the assessments must meet the demands of both the unit specification and the SCQF level. But the assessments and any reassessments must also be practicable for you to deliver and carry out within your centre for all your candidates. When it comes to the marking instructions, again, that's one of the pivotal things that will ensure that your assessment is valid, reliable, and also practicable and hits the standard. It's important that you can clearly define the acceptable evidence that a candidate would be expected to produce for any assessment that you're developing, and that you would discuss this with anybody involved within the assessment process, assessing that individual unit within your centre. And that's where the standardisation process comes in. Once you've actually carried out the assessment, the final part is the post-assessment review process. And it's really important to review what worked and where improvements or refinements can be made after any assessment process has taken place. And this critical review and reflection is key to continuous quality improvement. My top tip here would be, if you're doing this for both formative and also for summative assessment purposes, I would ask for feedback from others, from other team members, and also the students who were involved in the assessment process. So things like, was anything about the language unclear? Were there any issues that came up? Because with all the pre-planning, and even with careful pre-planning, things can sometimes be missed. So it's really important that you have that thorough post-assessment review, and you use that to adapt and to refine any future assessments for candidates that will be carried forward in future semesters or blocks. So just to sum up on some of the best practice to do with summative assessment, it's absolutely critical that you reflect on any changes to mandatory documents and also are aware and updated of any changes in practice and or approach, and this cannot be understated. Again, by signing up for SQA My Alerts, that's one key way to ensure that you are getting the latest information into your inbox about changes to do with the particular subject areas that you are particularly concerned about and that you deliver as a lecturer within the college. Remember also to tap into the wider sector feedback by using SQA's external verification process and things like the internal assessment reporting, because this can be useful in two key ways. Firstly, it can be hugely reassuring because you may see examples of your existing practice highlighted as examples of strengths. It also can be useful because it might highlight some areas for improvement that you either haven't or should be considering moving forward in work that's been previously looked at by other centres. And for those of you who aren't fully aware of this, please also be aware that most subjects will be carrying out a review of NQ unit outcomes and assessment standards during this year, and to keep abreast of any changes for implementation during session 2017-18. So where would you find these documents? I know that at times the SQA website can seem a little bit like a foreign land and quite difficult to navigate around. But the documents can be found on your relevant subject pages. But for those of you delivering across more than one qualification block, you will have to look at several pages if you're delivering a mixture of non-advanced units, for example, skills for work, national qualifications, and or higher national or SVQ units. So what exactly should you be looking out for? Well, in terms of support available, if you're delivering national qualification units or skills for work courses, we would suggest that you look firstly on the main SQA website and perhaps sign up to attend some of the events for teachers and lecturers that are being delivered this year through SQA's Understanding Standards programme. The web link on this slide will take you directly to that relevant page after this presentation. For anyone delivering units that are part of the new CFE national courses, remember also to look at the latest information on your subject and also at any changes in guidance and next steps for session 2016-17. If you missed webinar 2, you might also want to look at the recording on the CDN website, which explains some of these changes in greater detail. CPD is also available for college staff through SQA's team of customer liaison team and/or subject implementation managers. So there's a whole host of support out there for you folks, so you don't need to feel as though that you are struggling to find information on any of these topics. In terms of support available at HN and SVQ, you will see that there's a link here in this slide, and this will take you directly to a variety of useful support resources for qualifications that you may be delivering. Within this link, there are a full list of all HN and NQ centre-devised assessments that are currently available that you may wish to use. Currently, there are 11 examples on this particular web page. There's also now a combined list of all HN exemplars and assessment support packs, and this includes a list of the European Social Fund produced support materials that were previously listed separately. The other thing that is found within this web link is a list of all SVQ support materials that are currently available. And there's also a very useful monthly updates link which will give you an early heads up about any changes that are upcoming that you might wish to be aware of. So for example, in that particular link, there are support materials available for the SVQ 2 and 3 in beauty therapy, the SVQ 3 in spa and massage therapy, and also the SVQ 2 in nail services, all within the area of health and beauty. Now, to access some of these materials, particularly the ones that are on the SQA website, please remember that you'll have to go through your SQA coordinator within your college. But this particular link will at least give you an indication of what is available, so you know exactly what to ask for, and that is hugely helpful. This is a final webinar in this series in assessment, as I said earlier on. But for those of you with an interest in learning more about assessment, and assessment perhaps within specific subject areas that you teach, there are a few additional opportunities that are maybe worth mentioning. CDN will be running a full day event on assessment later this month on the 24th of October, which would give you the chance to come and meet with fellow teachers and lecturers to develop your understanding of assessment and assessment planning through interactive workshops. SQA also have a variety of other resources to support teachers and lecturers, including opportunities for online learning via the SQA Academy and so forth, and those are definitely well worth going in and having a look at. Following on from the training of SQA college subject nominees this month and later in November, CDN are also planning to run a number of subject-specific webinars and/or short workshops early in session or early at the start of 2017. And the focus of these webinars or workshops will be on key subjects delivered in colleges, with the intention that any events or webinars that we run will be complementary to SQA's planned Understanding Standards programme for 2016-17.